Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh and I'm going to go over what is happening here today. We've heard about the Strait of Hormuz with the blockades that President Trump has now put into effect as of just a few hours ago. And in response to that, Iran is saying that the forces, the United States forces there in the blockades in the Gulf ports are illegal and act of piracy. We're going to let you know what that means. And when it comes to J.D. Vance, well, he's had a tough week of two failed things that he decided that he was going to be in charge of, and we're going to give you the latest on that. And the Pope versus President Trump. What does that mean? So you want to stay tuned for all of those. Then, of course, when it comes to Canada, today are three by-elections that could mean a big difference for Prime Minister Mark Carney and what it means for a Liberal potential majority. That is for today. So now when we go back to what is happening in the Middle East, this has been the topic since the end of February. We saw a war take place for 40 days. And essentially, it started on February 28th, where President Trump said this was going to be a regime change in Iran. Then that changed quickly to removing the enriched uranium in Iran. Then that changed quickly to opening up the Strait of Hormuz. We know that the ceasefire that started on April 7th, it was based on 10 points that Iran put forward. And over the weekend, we had Vice President J.D. Vance with Steve Witkoff, as well as Jared Kushner. And remind you, Jared Kushner is not working at the White House. He doesn't. We don't know what his official title or capacity or security clearance is, but he was there at those meetings as he was prior to when the war started. So that took place this weekend in Islamabad with the Iranian delegation, and to lead to a very short press conference by Vice President J.D. Vance saying that they have failed to come to an agreement. And then from that point, you had President Trump really give a deadline and say that he's going to have U.S. ships blockading the Strait of Hormuz. So, and that came after Iran said that the Strait of Hormuz is open for civilian vessels, but not naval military vessels. So this is, the latest of what is escalating. But just to give you, take a few steps back of what this all means is that, you had Iran really blocking Strait of Hormuz, which affects a big amount, right? So when you come look at the statistics, it's about 20% of the global oil supply in the world, and that's also about 25 to 27% of the global seaborne oil trade that takes place. This is the Strait of Hormuz, where Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the other GCC countries export their oil, and based on the numbers of export is how much they produce. When you look at somewhere like for Saudi Arabia, they were down 20% on production during the 40-day war and 50% down on shipping their oil. So this heavily impacts the region when it comes to their economy because oil is one of the main sources of their revenue. And the Strait of Hormuz essentially is 20% of global LNG natural gas transit, and you're looking at about 20 million barrels per day that move through the Strait of Hormuz. So that's about 1 in every 5 barrels of oil globally was disrupted because of the Strait of Hormuz being blocked by Iranian forces. This is during the 40-day war. And then you have the shipping disruptions that took place during the war. We were talking about a number of about 138 ships per day, going down to almost zero, to just a handful of Iranian oil tankers going to China. And we've heard, of course, to India. So certain key places, tanker traffic fell by 70% initially, then to near shutdown. So you can understand how devastating that is in that 40-day war. And we're talking about 150 to about 2,000 vessels were stranded during peak disruption. So and if you recall, President Trump said that Iran could then sell its oil of those stranded vessels. And it also gave Russia an opportunity to sell its oil. It's just this is where the war had escalated with the goals of why this war even started changing day by day, week by week, as we saw the escalations. So when you look at the military activity in that area, you're looking at about 50 plus attacks on ships being reported during that time frame, over 16 merchant ships being damaged, 12 seafarers being killed or missing right now, and essentially Iran retaining about 60% or more of what was taking place in terms of the shipments and fast attack naval units. And now, since the talks that took place this past weekend in Islamabad, even though the negotiations failed, according to Vice President J.D. Vance and as well as the Iranians, Iran said the Strait of Hormuz is open for civilian vessels. But yet, President Trump has now moved in the American vessels to block the Strait of Hormuz. Essentially, they're looking at blocking Iranian shipments. So now Iran is retaliating, or said it's going to retaliate by again targeting the GCC countries. So this could escalate very quickly. And this is why we're staying on top of it. But just to give you an idea of what it means with the oil markets, right? So oil surged from $100 to $104 per barrel. And that spike is about 7 to 8% in a single day, which is very significant. And analysts are actually warning that this could go up to $150, $170 per barrel if this escalation continues. And I don't know how it helps having the U.S. Tankers there to block the Strait of Hormuz, where the President Trump's objective for the last little while has been to open up the Strait of Hormuz. So now, if you're asking why did these talks fail, what actually took place in these talks? Okay, so essentially, what we've heard come out of these talks that VP J.D. Vance was leading on behalf of the American delegation was that, while he was talking to the president, essentially President Trump moved the goalpost on Iran, pushing to never allow Iran to have nuclear weapons, which was something that was always the case with President Trump and previous administrations, but now changing that goalpost to never allowing Iran to enrich uranium for civilian purposes. Now, this is a very hardline position that President Trump has taken, and therefore a deal could not be reached, because we know that Iran's legal right under the NPT was to enrich uranium to about 3.67. And that was under the JCPOA that Obama led about 10 years ago. And those were negotiations that really took place for about a decade, and then had, the European Union and all the other countries sign in on it. When President Trump took office in his first term, he tore that up, essentially, which led Iran to increase it to 20 to 60 units when it comes to enriching its uranium. Now, no nuclear bombs have been found on Iranian soil, but this is the area of contention. So now President Trump's saying, zero enrichment, and we're going to block the Strait of Hormuz, block any Iranian ships going through, any Iranian vessels going through. So that's where things are at. So this is escalatory, not diplomacy, as we're seeing, and that's why it could shake things up very quickly. And then Iran is responding to that by saying that the naval blockade on its vessels by the United States in international waters would be illegal, and they're calling it piracy, and saying that no Gulf ports would be safe if this continues. So we know that in a way they're pressuring the GCC nations that share the Strait of Hormuz to contact their American allies, counterparts, to talk to them to be able to resolve this issue and not have further escalations, as we're seeing. What is this about, right? This is about, I think, the narrative at the end of the day about who controls the flow of global energy, right? Is it Iran or is it the United States? And it looks like President Trump is flexing his muscle to say that, no, we control the flow of energy by blocking it. And not the Iranians anymore, because the Iranians said that it's open. So this is really what's happening. It's a bit confusing if you ask me, but I think that's part of what's happening. I think because the objectives of this war has changed so much, the goalpost has changed about what the United States is trying to achieve, what is Iran trying to achieve, what is Israel and all of this trying to achieve. That and just fast-paced actions that are taking place, that it's very easy to lose track of, what is happening and why is it happening, and that's a very critical thing. When it comes to this entire region, we know that there's countries that are being affected since this entire war began, right? So what is the global dependency on the Strait of Hormuz? So now 84% of the oil that comes out of Strait of Hormuz goes to Asia, right? China alone takes about 40%, Japan 75%, India 60%, South Korea 70%, leaves them highly exposed. And when it comes to European countries, well, they import 25 to 30% of their oil from the Middle East route. So this impacts immediately the European Union and United Kingdom, France, Germany, really being highly exposed in all of this. So now this call of blockades is essentially seen as an act of aggression. Iran is calling it piracy. And you really have to think, was JD Vance sent there in maybe goodwill to have these talks, since the goalpost changed on Iran enriching its uranium even for civilian purposes? While you saw President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio really had a UFC fight in Florida, in Miami, having a great time, while JD Vance was negotiating essentially world peace in many ways, because this conflict has affected the global economy, and not to even mention the fertilizer that comes out of the Strait of Hormuz that Africa and places like in Southeast Asia rely on for their own crops and domestic consumption. So now, with President Trump saying, okay, well, talks failed because Iran will not has not agreed to zero enrichment of oil, then we're going to create the blockades. Now, who's responded to that? China has opposed the blockade. Europe is very cautious, still asking for de-escalation. Israel is supporting the U.S. position. Meanwhile, Israeli forces are occupying southern Lebanon, and you have the Hezbollah attacking Israel as well. And that conflict is taking place. Meanwhile, that was part of the 10 points that was put forward by Iran that President Trump had said that are negotiable items on April 7th, if you recall from his Truth Social post, which essentially started the ceasefire for 2 weeks. So it's very shaky grounds right now. But the economic impact has been, prices spiking through the roof, the markets reacting to it, and through the 40-day war, you saw President Trump come out on Monday and say there are talks being taking place with the Iranians, with key figures, and things are going to be under control. And then by the end of the week, really threatening the Iranians, and Iranians saying that, hey, we're not in talks. So by the beginning of the week, you had the markets go up because the president was saying there's going to be stability. And then by the end of the week, when the president, was really going hard on Iran, and Iran saying we are not talking, the markets would tank. And we saw that price disruption when it comes to, a USD per barrel of oil, and that really fluctuating. So you had the prices spiking, you had shipping insurance surge, because essentially if ships are not allowed through the Strait of Hormuz, and they could risk being attacked, and we know that there was mines being placed in certain parts of the Strait of Hormuz, the shipping costs went through the roof, and of course this creates the supply chain disruptions. So now what's happening when it comes to this current situation? It could escalate, it could have a wider regional conflict, because Iran is going to retaliate with the GCC countries. So this is a very critical point. This also means that the chokehold will continue and oil supply will be reduced. Now, when it comes to the United Kingdom, you have the UK Prime Minister Starmer saying that he's going to have a summit of leaders to address the Strait of Hormuz this week. Essentially, he's also refusing to back the United States with the Hormuz blockade. They said, we're not going to join you with this blockade, sir. But they're pushing for diplomacy approach. Within this, he is trying to align the European Union. And now you're hearing, the Prime Minister of Britain, who's, we saw Brexit take place, right, for over a decade now. And now you have a sitting United Kingdom Prime Minister saying that he needs to get closer to the European Union and the European allies because he's seeing that, Brexit and being on your own, it's going to have its own risks. We know that the United Kingdom had, the first trade agreement with the United States for President Trump's second term. And since then, there's been a fallout in terms of not, sending tankers to the Strait of Hormuz from the United Kingdom, and now also saying we're not going to join you in blocking it and we're not going to join the war. But Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, is meeting with Emmanuel Macron of France, and they're saying that within days they're going to talk about ceasefire, diplomatic resolution. I assume Canada would probably be part of that because Prime Minister Mark Carney has really spent good time in the European Union in terms of making sure he's closer to the allies there, and really having a multinational coordination for shipping security framework to de-escalate this. Now, this is of course in contrast with what the United States is doing, right, when it comes to this blockade that they started today. But the goal of what the European Union wants to do with Keir Starmer really leading the way is to have, a stable route for the Strait of Hormuz without escalating conflict. Now that there has been some sort of ceasefire, we know not in Lebanon and Israel, but when it comes to Israel, United States, and Iran, and then Iran with the GCC countries. So while the United States is having hard power in terms of its blockade strategy, UK and France are going to be going through a very diplomatic, controlled security presence is what they're going for. And they're going to be asking for their Western allies to come to the front. So it'll be very interesting to see what the response there will be, right? So Europe is trying to prevent this like full-scale regional war, avoid energy shocks through the global markets as well as in their own countries, and maintain an independence from what they're seeing their American counterparts under President Trump do. So we're going to see what comes out of this emergency summit, which is, for the diplomatic resolution and protection of shipping without escalations, and of course reducing the oil shock and the war spillover that has been taking place in that region. So, stay tuned with us. We're going to give you the latest development on this, what it means for every country, what they plan on doing. Now, when you ask about, what are the best case scenarios of this entire thing, it could be hoped that United States and Iran will come back to the table and come with measures that would work for both sides. But we haven't heard from any of that. We haven't heard from the two counterparts meeting again, right? And the only thing we've heard is through escalations and now through the moves of the United States. And meanwhile, we have Pakistan that has sent fighter jets to Saudi Arabia while these talks are taking place. We've seen reports of China shipping ammunition to Iran while the ceasefire talks are supposed to be taking place. And so this is a very critical time because at any moment things could shift, and it means something completely different for the Iranian people as well as the region. Now, something interesting that's come out of all of this is that Qatar is having its own conversation with Iran. And this is part of, what we could see take place between the GCC countries and Iran. Maybe they're no longer going to rely on the United States as being the mediator in between in terms of following what President Trump is going to do, but perhaps have a key dialogue with Iran to be able to protect their ports and their shipments, right? So Qatar has positioned themselves as a neutral mediator, and they're trying to bridge the gap between the US and Iran. And this is, of course, after what we've seen take place in Pakistan, that haven't gone so well, even though Pakistan is trying for another ability to bring the two parties to the table again. And of course, we're going to see what it means for Lebanon ceasefire. We know that this week, Israel and Lebanon officials are supposed to meet in the White House to come to some sort of terms on ceasefire there. So that's a separate thing. That does not include Iran. And so, many moving parts at the same time. And this is critical to the safety and security of the people of the countries in that region. But of course, when it comes to the global prices on fertilizer, we're hearing experts say that if this continues, that we're talking about real famine take place in Africa and in other countries. And meanwhile, the United Nations is trying to step into this whole issue when it comes to Strait of Hormuz as a fertilizer corridor, right? This is important because the United Nations Office of Project Services is leading what they call an urgent diplomatic push, and their goal is to make sure that this is a safe passageway for at least fertilizer shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, right? And these high-level talks are taking place in New York, which is the headquarters of the United Nations, and they're saying that this is important, that at least if oil is an issue, that we're able to get the fertilizer through to make sure that these things are taken care of. So, of course, we're going to see what the United Nations comes up with. And in terms of, are they able to implement it? Is this something that take place if there's a chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz, whether by the Iranians or by the Americans, okay? Because we've seen this story repeat in the last 40 days, okay? And now, big story when it comes to the Pope, right? The Pope, the Pope that sits in the Vatican, which is the Catholic Pope. He is the first American Pope, Pope Leo, essentially having words for President Donald Trump. Okay, this started as in his sermon. The Pope really, said that civilians should really implore on their leaders for diplomacy, and this should be we should strive for peace over war, which you would expect the Pope to say this. This is something that we do need to hear at this times, but this troubled President Trump as he hit back to the Pope, essentially saying that he's weak on crime and on foreign policy, and that the Pope really had his position because of President Trump's influence, which we know is not the case. We know that foreign politicians cannot influence what the cardinals when they decide in terms of who should be the next pope, and that is a process that is highly regarded in the Vatican. So you had this back and forth, and the Pope essentially saying that he is not going to succumb to the threats and he has got no fear. So this is the first time you could see in history that a pope would have such stark comments for a world leader, and as an American, and for a sitting president to hit back at the Pope the same way. And we know that this is not sitting well. There's about 70 million Catholics in the United States, part of MAGA, right? Catholics, Christians, and we know that President Trump put that post up on Truth Social on Easter Sunday about Iran and ending a civilization and dropping the F word, and saying praise be to Allah on Easter Sunday. And for those who don't know what Easter Sunday is, Good Friday was the of Jesus Christ being crucified, and Easter Sunday is celebrated as the resurrection of Jesus Christ after the crucifixion. So it's a very holy weekend for Christians and Catholics. There's over 2 billion in the world, and you had President Trump put that up, which really upset a lot of his MAGA supporters, as well as MAGA supporter influencers, such as Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly and the rest of them. Now put that aside. And now you fast forward, and then yesterday, with the words of conflict with the Pope from the president, he then put up an AI image of himself as what would appear to be a Christ-like figure, which he then later took down. So, these are things that, people are left speechless in terms of what to say, but this is what is taking place between all of that. Now, could this be that this is a distraction? But it is a very insulting distraction to really what's happening with the war that's taking place in the Middle East. And this escalation has been continuing on those levels. Now, coming to here in Canada, well, tonight there is the exit polls in Canada for the 3 ridings that are for by-election. There's 2 seats in Toronto, 1 in Markham. It is expected probably the Liberals will have a majority, but it is to be seen. We don't know yet until we count the votes. So Mark Carney could really be on the brink of, winning a majority government. We've never seen before that a party would go from minority to majority in by-elections. Never seen before. You'd have 5 MPs crossing the floor, 4 Conservatives and 1 NDP, which we saw happen from last year all the way until just a week ago. And so we're going to be keeping an eye on those 2 seats in Toronto, 1 in Quebec for this by-election tonight. You want to stay with Ymedia on the latest numbers and what this means. And if Mark Carney gets his majority, then he doesn't need an opposition party to support him on his agenda when it comes to affordability and what he says he wants to do for Canadians under the threat of tariffs and what we are seeing with the escalation of this war that's, raising the cost of living, the war in the groceries, and as well as what it means for gas prices. But there was also a poll that was conducted in terms of, why, what do people think about this party and what do people think about this leader and what are the issues that concern Canadians most? And for that, well, there was a poll done by Nanos that was just released. And what they did was they called 1,000 Canadians, landline or cell phone numbers, and it was automatically generated, random numbers and people over the age of 18. And from that, they found out the top line numbers that when it comes to who do Canadians support, whereas the Liberals under Carney came up at 46%, the Conservatives at 33%, led by Pierre Poilievre, NDP's at 10%. They have 6 seats, but 10% here in terms of ballot support, and the Bloc, Green, and the PCC in very low single digits numbers. So the Liberals are leading by 13 points nationally on those things. When it comes to preferred prime minister, well, Mark Carney got 57% with Pierre Poilievre with 22%. Pierre Poilievre lost 4 MPs crossing the floor to Liberals. And so when it comes to preferred prime minister, with these 1,000 Canadians that were polled by Nanos, it was 35-point difference gap in leadership preference for Mark Carney versus Pierre Poilievre. And when it came to the trend of what is it that Canadians care more about, it continuously came up as strong economics, seeing that Mark Carney is going to be a better manager at the economy, given that he's a banker. He was previously the governor of Bank of England and as well as the United Kingdom. So believing that he is going to be able to navigate these, the hard waters of where this economy is going when it comes to tariffs and affordability. And other top issues for Canadians were the economy. Job numbers are, of course, important when the economy is doing well. Jobs should be available. People should be earning a good standard of living, being able to support their families. And then the second to that was U.S. and Trump relations. We know that the trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada is due this year. What does that mean? And inflation, cost of living is top of mind. So if this means that we're going to go into a majority territory, that means we're not going to have a general election for another 3 years. And it is to be seen what this Liberal government will do when it comes to affordability. You want to stay tuned with us for tonight. We're going to go live for the exit polls of those 3 seats, one in Montreal area, the other one being Scarborough Southwest, and another one at University of Rosedale. We're going to see who the local riding citizens are going to choose to be their next MP and what that means for the future of Canada's governance. I'm Ramona Singh. This is the Ymedia Newsroom, and until later, stay tuned and be well. Thank you.
Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.